Hello, welcome to all those who are joining us. We'll be waiting another minute or so for all of the people in the waiting room to join us, and then we'll get going with this conversation. All right, so good afternoon, good evening, or good morning to you, depending on where you are located. Welcome to the final installment of our three-part series, which is on global conversations about digital disruptions. My name is Heidi Tvorek. I am the director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, located at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. But I would like to acknowledge the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, who have called this area where I'm located home for many thousands of years and continue to do so today, and on whose land we have the privilege of gathering and learning. And I'd like to invite you, joining us from all around the world, to reflect on the Indigenous lands that you are on today. So this is, as I've said, the final installment of a three-part series that we've called Global Conversations About Digital Disruptions. It's a collaboration between the center that I direct, CSDI, the Konwakai Chair in Japanese Research, which is held by Yves Tiberghien. And then in this particular instance, we're very grateful for support from the Center for Korean Research at UBC as well. Just some Zoom logistics, so I'm sure you're all familiar with them. If you want to turn on the transcript, you can do so using that function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You as participants don't have to use your cameras or microphones to ask questions. You can click on the Q&A button at the bottom to ask your questions. So please do ask your questions using the Q&A button. I'll be monitoring the Q&A window, and then I'll ask those questions, and I'll just use participants' first names only unless you instruct me in the question otherwise. Before we get started and I introduce our three distinguished speakers, I'd just like to thank Panthea Purmalek for all of her help in pulling this together. And I'd also like to acknowledge my co-convener, Professor Yves Tiberghien, who unfortunately is not able to join us today as he is sort of caught up in the snow mess that's currently happening in Vancouver and on the way to various other locations. So he's very sorry not to join us, and I wouldn't have been able to put this together without his help. So now let me introduce our three fantastic speakers who are joining us today. First, we have Elina Noor, who is a senior fellow in the Asia program at Carnegie, where she focuses on developments in Southeast Asia, particularly the impact and implications of technology in reshaping power dynamics, governance, and nation building in the region. A native of Malaysia, Elina's work focuses on security developments in Southeast Asia, global governance and technology, and preventing or countering violent extremism. Previously, Elina was associate professor at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. And prior to that, she was director of foreign policy and security studies at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia. She was also formerly with the Brookings Institution's project on US relations with the Islamic world. Between 2017 and 2019, Elina was a member of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, and she currently serves on the ICRC's Global Advisory Board on Digital Threats During Conflict. So you see, brings a huge amount of experience on security and digital threats. Our second panelist is Dr. Atsushi Sunami, who is the president of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation and executive advisor to the president at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Japan. He's also a member of the expert panel for the development of economic security legislation of the Cabinet Secretariat of Japan. And then last but not least, we have Professor Henry Farrell, who is SNF Agora Institute professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, sometimes known as SAIS, and the 2019 winner of the Friedrich Schiedel Prize for Politics and Technology. He works on a variety of topics, including democracy, the politics of the internet, and international and comparative political economy. And he's written a whole host of articles and book chapters, as well as two books. The first one titled The Political Economy of Trust, Interest, Institutions, and Interfirm Cooperation, published by Cambridge University Press. And then the second with Abraham Newman, Of Privacy and Power, The Transatlantic Fight Over Freedom and Security, and that was published by Princeton University Press. And I would add, though not in this bio, the coiner with Abraham Newman of a term that I think many people are using sometimes now without knowing where it came from, of weaponized interdependence. So how could we not have someone talking about weaponized interdependence on this panel? Okay, so what are we trying to do today in the next hour and 8 minutes? We already set this up with 3 aims. The first was we wanted to understand the value and the limitations of using a security lens to understand the current state of global digital competition. So for our 3 panelists, for context, we had one session that was on elections, we had another that was thinking about trade, and then we wanted to have a final one that was thinking about security, and all of these looking at the world of the digital. The second then was to discuss whether and how components of this digital space are interacting with the effects of competition digitally, but also elsewhere. And then finally, because this is obviously the interest of my center, which works on democracy, we wanted to understand the effects of securitized digital spaces on democracies and democratic institutions. What we'll be doing today then is we'll open with around 40-ish minutes of discussion between me and the panelists, getting their kind of perspectives on some of these issues, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions from you, the attendees. So please feel free, whenever those questions occur to you, to pop them already into the Q&A, and I'll be sure to get to as many of them as we possibly can. So with that, let's move to the discussion. So we've entitled this Security in Our Digital Future. So of course, my first question has to ask about concepts, which is something that academics love to do. So I wanted to ask then the 3 of you, based on your work and research, how would you conceptualize what we've called the weaponization or securitization of digital spaces? And the reason I ask this question is because some of these terms may be unfamiliar to some of the audience, or they may have one understanding, you might have another. So it seems a good opportunity for us to level set at the start, so to speak. So we'll start with Elina, then Dr. Sunami, and then Professor Farrell. So Elina, over to you.
Well, thank you, Heidi. First of all, I have to caveat my response by saying I am not an academic. So I bring maybe a slightly different understanding of your question. I see it really as a scale, maybe a sliding scale of securitization on the one hand and weaponization on the other. And I think weaponization is on the far end of that spectrum as I see it. Securitization, which is a difficult word for me to pronounce apparently, is also, it can slide up and down that scale, but it's not as severe as weaponization. And I think now in Southeast Asia, we're seeing that take place, and governments and the private sector are wondering where we are right now with the sliding scale of the securitization of tech, and the weaponization, the possible weaponization of tech. And we'll get into this a little more, I'm sure. But in short, I see it as sort of a spectrum of severity when it comes to how tech is being conceived of and evolving.
Yeah, thank you. And no caveats for not being an academic are required whatsoever. It's our delight to host conversations that are between policy and research. Is also something both Eve and I are very interested in. Now over to you, Dr. Sunami, how you would conceptualize these 2 terms.
Well, let me first of all just sort of reflect on my personal kind of experience in dealing with this issue. Japan is hosting G7 Hiroshima this year. And I remember 7 years ago when we hosted the previous G7 in Japan. And at that time, I was a special advisor to the Cabinet Office for Science and Technology Innovation. And we launched what we call Society 5.0, which is really transform Japan and Japanese society, and especially economic growth model strategy based on the data-driven, complete digitalization of goods and services. And so at that time, the late Prime Minister Abe announced also something called the Data Free Flow with Trust at the World Economic Forum. But around there, it's more on the sort of what Elina was saying, that we are sort of aware of the important securitization of all this digital infrastructure, but not so much in a sense of weaponization or being weaponized around Japan, and looking at this issue more of the security lenses. But the challenge now this year, when we host the G7 Hiroshima, one of the main issue will be economic security, and the things like the of course cybersecurity issues or even disinformation is something that is threatening our basic foundations of our democratic and political and social system, and how we can really protect ourselves from this kind of weaponization. At the same time, of course, we're trying to invest in sort of compete with other countries and other competitors on things like AI and other usage of those new area like metaverse and others. And so this is going to be a very challenging time. But what I see looking back from the previous G7 we hosted and this year's G7, that there are so much elements about this weaponization and becoming quite real in the policy discussions. So I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Last but not least, Henry Farrell.
Well, for better or for worse, I am an academic, which means that concepts are my bread and butter in ways that are sometimes a bit painful and unfortunate. And as Professor Tworek very kindly said at the beginning, Abe Newman and I did come up with this notion of weaponized interdependence to try and capture some of the ways in which the world has changed and in which economic and financial and information networks have become effectively new kinds of battlefields. And I think when I think about weaponization more generally and securitization, very crudely, I think weaponization is what you do when things when you actually use something as a tool of coercion or perhaps as a tool of surveillance. And securitization involves how you think about something. And talking from the United States, because of course SAIS is right in the middle of Washington, DC, my sense is that for a long time, the United States weaponized these networks very, very effectively, didn't realize very often how other parts of the world sometimes were terrified at the amount of power that the United States had in cyber with respect to surveillance and other capacities. But it didn't itself particularly think about the internet as being a securitized space. I think that has changed over the last few years. It began to change in the Trump administration when Pompeo and others started talking about the need for a clean internet. And I think that it is that this has only begun to accelerate substantially during the Biden administration, where we see the internet and a variety of other technologies being thought of in a securitized way, and also the Biden administration being able to effectively make policy on the basis of these fears in ways that I think the Trump administration very often had difficulty in doing. So there has just been, I think, a profound shift where the United States now really perceives this as being a securitized space in ways which I think it did not perceive it as being a number of years ago, when the internet was basically God, apple pie, and American values all rolled up into one.
Yeah, thank you. So that kind of already starts to move us into my second question for the three of you, which is just to maybe lay out your key concerns around this weaponization and securitization of the digital space, perhaps looking over the coming decade. So what then, to make it super concrete, what are some possible scenarios that we might encounter in the near future that we might need to be concerned about? So we'll flip up the order and we'll start with Dr. Sunami, then Prof. Farrell, and then Elina Noor.
Yes. Well, I sort of mentioned about disinformation and other cybersecurity issues, but as we discussed more in terms of economic security and reality of being, weaponized through this interdependence and economic coercion issue, that we are in Japan. Actually, we passed the economic security promotion law last year in May, and which consists of 4 main pillars, and which are the enhancing supply chain resilience. The second is preserving functional capabilities of core infrastructures. And the third is fostering technological foundation and the public-private partnership, which really forces more investment in or emerging technology and so on. So those that are AI and other areas. And then, and finally, we are now introducing the establishment of the secret patent system. It all has to do with intellectual property, but also intelligence network, which is very, very unique. Sort of in Japan, this kind of things is very difficult to put forth of because of the past history after the World War II, and in bringing this security lenses to economic activities and social activities. And now everything else, as we push for a more connected and digitalized and digital transformation that we are pushing for. At the same time, of course, everything else being under the threat and there's security concerns that goes around it. So I think there are many areas that are going to be a very important in terms of protection and the discussion of security. In a cyberspace, that definitely is the connector of everything. So I think this is going to be a threat in all sorts of areas. So we are really struggling to make sure that we cover. Well, I don't think we can cover everything, but what we can do is to move forward with with all these possible scenarios, including disinformation that we are facing at the moment. So.
Yeah, thank you. Prof. Farrell, some potential scenarios or other things that raise concern for you in this space?
So I think two. One very briefly builds on what Dr. Sunami has just talked about, which is the possibility that as we begin to see economics and security get blended together in the ways that he talks about, that we're going to see a lot of dynamics happening in the economy, which we have traditionally associated with military problems. And in particular, we're going to see escalation dynamics. That is where I am worried about the threat that you pose to me. I take actions then which you think pose a threat to you, and this leads to you retaliating in a sense or trying to protect yourself. And so you can see rapid and sudden and very substantial decreases in security as everybody becomes paranoid about everybody else. And this is something that Abe Newman and I, we have a forthcoming book, Underground Empire, in September, where we talk about some of the problems and challenges that this may pose to the world economy. So I think that's one dynamic that I'm worried about. The other is the ways in which the kinds of problems that Dr. Sunami was raising with respect to disinformation. What happens with the advent of large language models like ChatGPT, GPT-4, whenever it comes out? Because effectively what these models do is they make it possible to really create relatively convincing disinformation at scale. You can just type in a command, more or less, and sort of, okay, ChatGPT, give me what a Midwestern swing voter might say on the policy of net neutrality opposing it. And you can get it to do that on sort of multiple thousands of times as the technology improves, and you can get lots and lots of comments, which you can then use to flood commenting systems. You can see how this could degrade social media in some very important ways. And while I think that it's much, much harder to really manipulate people with disinformation than many of the critics worry, I think that it is possible to degrade the spaces in which democracies discuss politics. Effectively, when nobody knows who is real and who is not real anymore, it becomes really, really difficult to have the public debate, public discussion that democracy needs in order to solve problems. And so I worry that that is a scenario that is approaching that we have only begun to think about with respect to large language models.
Yes, and I think, something that certainly some of those who were working on them, we think of examples like Timnit Gebru, who was working on these things within Google and then was, fired / resigned in very controversial circumstances, has been trying to point out for some time that there are many issues within large language models. And the only tiny thing I would add before turning to Elina Noor is we already see that chat GPT produces what we might call disinformation, namely that it makes up books that people have written. So you never know, if we put this in, we might find that Henry Farrell has written 10 books he didn't even know he has written, that it even has gone to the extent of making up ISBN numbers for books. So we already see some deep flaws, and the question is what happens with that and where it goes. And Elina Noor, lastly, over to you, your kind of concerns, worst case scenarios for what could be coming for us in the next decade.
Yeah, I think there are several ways that I would look at this. And one of those ways is to pick up on Professor Farrell's earlier point about securitization, going back perhaps to the Clean Network Initiative under Trump. I would suggest that it's actually been a lot earlier than that. And I think that securitization came about more starkly with the Snowden revelations. I mean, espionage is, of course, as old as time. But I think the scale and speed of that surveillance that was carried out really shocked many, many parts of the world, including friends and allies of the United States. And the sophistication of that surveillance has only become greater over the years, requiring even more sophisticated capabilities to match those capabilities in order to protect, defend, and make networks and systems more resilient. And that's onerous on countries, particularly in the developing world, that don't have that same level of maturity, cyber maturity, capacity or capability. And along with that, it's not just the operational maturity or evolution that I think brings about a lot of concern. It's also the doctrines and the policies and strategies that underpin some of those operations. And we're seeing inventions, innovations in those policies that are frankly quite disturbing and that are pushing the boundaries of what is acceptable and what is not. We're seeing this in international legal frameworks and the norms that are being talked about at international levels. And so I think this on one level is slightly disturbing. The other thing, of course, that's been talked about is misinformation, disinformation. Again, nothing new for countries of the developing world, particularly in Southeast Asia, where there are huge numbers of very, very diverse communities. And that threat of having the social fabric of a community just wrenched apart because of falsehoods, because of misinformation, has always been there. And it becomes even worse now with some of the things that we've talked about, like ChatGPT, which, scrapes from all levels of the barrels of the internet, right? Including the false ones. And so when you overlay that onto some of the entrenched fissures in communities in countries in Southeast Asia, that risk of nation splitting becomes tenfold, 100-fold. Finally, I would just say that the securitization/weaponization of technology is now evolving into something that Southeast Asian countries in particular no longer have the luxury of doing, and that's insulating economics and development through technology from security and the securitization of technology. And we're seeing this, I think, most prominently with the disruption of global supply chains and semiconductor chips in particular. Of course, you can argue that Southeast Asian countries are benefiting from it and can leverage on this, but there is a real risk of fragmentation on many levels.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful to get three quite different perspectives on that question. It just gives us more things to worry about. But now we have some time to hopefully think about potentially solutions or at least approaches. So, my next question sort of builds a little bit on those concerns about democracy that were coming out from the answers of all three of you. So I'm wondering, how can we reconcile this sort of concerns around security in a secure digital space with freedom and accountability in democracies? Elina, as you point out, this is not a new question. In the sort of digital version of this question, going back at least to the Snowden revelations, but I think it's a question, that we're continually asking anew, how we reconcile a secure digital space with freedom and accountability in democracy. So first, Henry Farrell, then Elina Noor, and then Atsushi Sunami. So over to you, Henry.
So I think that this is a really difficult set of problems, and I think that it is also a set of problems that academics like myself have largely fallen down on. So if I look at the research out there on threats to democracy, there's a lot on the supply side, on what the threats are, how they work when they seem to work, when they don't seem to work. What we don't actually have, and this in some ways goes to what Ms. Noor was saying about societies in Southeast Asia, we don't have a very good sense of how it is that the democracy itself can protect itself. We don't have a very good sense even of what kinds of information democracies need in order to be able to function well, and where instead a disagreement is appropriate or acceptable. And this is something, so it's especially important as a problem, as Ms. Noor said, when we talk about societies which are ethnically mixed. But we don't have, among political scientists, there's no real literature thinking about the informational qualities of democracy. Excuse me. So what I would love to see is something like, a little bit like what information security people, Bruce Schneier, who is a co-author of mine, I find very good in this. They think about information systems such as computers and servers or networks, and they start thinking about how is it that you can create the appropriate trade-offs so that you can still have the system working while sort of mitigating and recognizing that you're only mitigating, not eliminating the threats. So we need, in a certain sense, what you might call piecemeal democratic engineering. We need to be able to figure out, so how do you create solutions which allow for the kinds of information flow that democracies need to actually work, that you allow those information flows to happen, that mitigate and prevent some of the threats, but that recognize that you are never going to be fully perfect, and that efforts to try to create complete control, or as I think your question suggests, are probably going to be as bad as the potential problem that they purport to cure. So I can outline this in very vague ways, but of course, being a professor, this is what we're very good at, talking about the concepts. We actually need to move to the practice on this, and figuring out the practical knowledge that we need to do this properly is a huge, huge task that lies ahead of us.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it speaks to the fact that democracy and questions of free expression have trade-offs that are not captured in simple dichotomies of censorship versus free expression, and that there's a lot for scholars to think about and look into. And I think, at least from my perspective, it's a very interdisciplinary space that we need to build to really be able to talk about these effects, but bringing in things like democratic theory as well. So not leaving any of those disciplines aside. Elina Noor, over to you for your perspective.
Yeah, thanks. Obviously a very challenging question, but I think, again, one way to look at this is to unpack the meaning of democratic and democracies. And I think, speaking of difficult dichotomies, we have a tendency to split the world into democracies and authoritarian ones or autocracies. And I think the historical and lived experiences of many parts of the majority or the global south, developing world, whatever you might choose to call it, has uncovered that actually, there are democratic tendencies in authoritarian countries and vice versa. And one of the paradoxes, of course, is that democratic countries, or so-called democratic countries, have exported surveillance systems to other parts of the world. And this continues to happen, even though the focus is only on one or two countries in the world. And so I think we have to interrogate what this really means when it comes to who's supplying the tech, who's using the tech, and for what purposes as well. Of course, I think transparency and accountability are fantastic concepts, but going to Professor Farrell's point, how you implement that is, of course, a whole different set of questions. One answer, I think, lies in a robust civil society, but that also requires an informed civil society. In Southeast Asia, there's a lot of focus, maybe too much focus actually, on the development and economic aspects of digital technologies. Not enough consideration about kind of the peace security aspects of technology and the risks. I've talked about the ethnic fault lines in Southeast Asia, but you don't hear very much discussion at all on the risks of algorithmic bias, for example, and the data that's fed to all these algorithmic systems and what they can do to the social fabric of a nation. We've seen, Myanmar just fall apart for different reasons, of course, but aided and abetted by misinformation and disinformation through technology. And yet, we don't talk about how these can affect our societies in the region. And so I think one step, maybe the first step, is to have a more informed society in our various regions of the world.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just throw in one statistic, and this was a European survey, but was looking a couple of years ago at what percentage of people living in different countries understood that, say, that their Facebook or social media feeds were actually being determined by algorithms in preferences. And the country that had the best understanding of that percentage-wise was Finland, and that was a mere 39% of the population who understood that those feeds were algorithmic and not, say, chronological. So I think this is the problem you point out is a very global problem, where the country that is held up in many circles as the one that is sort of best equipped to deal with disinformation is one where less than half the population understands some of the basics of how social media works. Last but not least, Dr. Sunami.
Yes, well, this is a very important but difficult question. I mean, especially when you think about implementation side, as Professor Farrell or Elina was saying, I've been myself thinking how to really, this is a kind of race between mistrust and trust about public, about the system, about the democratic society and so on. And one thing we are trying to engage by pushing digital technology in the areas like evidence-based policymaking, for instance, that would enhance the trust of what the government is doing for you, or evaluating what the performance of the public sector, using AI and other latest digitalization and digital technology to really put forth more evidence-based, transparent, performance-based government programs, government policies, and this is a kind of way of sort of utilizing this space to build up the trust of government and the system that you have. Yeah, we have now engaged so much of disinformation, cybersecurity, and others, and like surveillance and which really this sort of enhances more distrust and mistrust of what you get from the public in the society. So it's kind of a race between which sort of the benefits of there's one on in the trust building kind of efforts, as well as the other is, well, we cannot trust anybody, but make sure that we protect ourselves on the information. The government will do the surveillance and other things, just because you cannot trust even your neighbor, so on and so forth. So this is a very kind of a race between those two things that are happening at the same time. But also there is a context in Asia where Elina was saying is more complex and more complicated. At the different stages of political systems and their different models and different way. And I just yesterday, I was just talking within our foundation of sort of restating our old program, what we call the Building Up Asia Public Intellectuals Fellowship Program, which is really to enhance this sort of the network of civil societies, the people and the intellectuals and nonprofits, NGOs, and journalists. This is kind of track 3, we call it. Track 1 is government, track 2 is more think tanks or whatever, and then the track 3 is this network of Asian network of sort of civil society, public intellectuals. And I think this kind of things are even coming back as a sort of very much necessity for in a cyberspace that we are seeing and transforming the Asian context. So I think we have to really to take the advantage of this new technology that are available to us, but to make sure to use more to build up the trust of what we build up for, rather than more focusing on how to protect them, and weaponizing and so on and so forth. So we need to do both. But of course, this is a kind of race. And I think the danger is that we are putting more emphasis on security and weaponization rather than building up a trust and enhancing what we have as a society and what we build up on. So I think these are the challenge that we are facing, and I hope we can do a lot in this area. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I just say, wearing one of my research hats, one of the problems that at the center we've been looking into is questions around online harassment of what I'm loosely calling professional groups, whether it's political candidates or it's health communicators and so on, because that's, I think, one of the real issues that we've seen for those who at certain points have been very eager to engage online, is that certainly for those engaging during COVID, many of those health communicators, some of them, for example, doctors doing this off the side of their desk, were experiencing horrific levels of online abuse, sometimes then translating into death threats, etc., offline, often intersecting with their gender, race, or religion, and that this had what some scholars call a chilling effect. That it meant that many people who really were quite eager to engage at the beginning of the pandemic have slowly moved away from that, and in some horrific cases suffer things like death threats and so on. So anyway, one of the projects that we have ongoing is really trying to figure out what can we do about this? I mean, there's obviously the question of the platforms themselves, but there's a whole host of other potential interventions so that we can have this sort of robust intervention that you're talking about without as many or as strong of the downsides as many of those people are currently experiencing, because we now have the issue of many people being quite unwilling to step into that spotlight, having seen what happened to their colleagues or people who look like them, come from their same backgrounds, etc. It's created some real issues, and that, of course, creates a space for disinformation, grifters, etc., to flourish because they're not as worried about, say, their professional reputation, for example. All right, so we'll move slowly into some questions for each one of you, and then we'll open up to the audience for any questions they have. So for Henry Farrell, obviously your work on weaponized interdependence is talking about not just digital flows, but also financial flows as well. So I wonder if we want to take an even bigger step back and just you want to talk about how you think those systemic risks, these sort of military dynamics of escalation, how they could potentially be mitigated for digital technology and trade?
It's a really tough set of questions. So I think that the first thing that we need, and that we actually don't have, is a strategic understanding of what it is that we're doing. And here I'm talking about the United States in particular as perhaps the most powerful actor. There isn't any equivalent to the kinds of national security documents that you have to guide the Pentagon when it thinks about deploying more conventional forms of war. There's nothing like that for the weaponization of financial networks, and there's very little that really touches on many of the important aspects of information networks either. And especially there's nothing that I think touches upon what both of the other panelists have talked to, which is the need of not just to think in terms of securitization and weaponization, but actually of building up civil society capabilities and shoring up some of the capabilities that we have to try and make society more robust. So I think the first thing I would like to see is the United States actually trying to think through what its security options are. This is something that Japan has actually done rather better. Japan has a real understanding of economic security and has tried effectively to articulate not quite a doctrine, but at least a more coherent strategic position. And I think that the next step from that is that I think that you actually need to have the same kinds of things that happened during the Cold War, where adversaries begin to talk to each other and begin to figure out what are their red lines, what are the things that they are prepared to tolerate, and build up at least some minimal mutual understanding that is not going to prevent some kinds of escalation from happening, but at least will lower the risks and will make sure that it is less likely that out and out errors and mistakes happen, because of course, as we know, such mistakes do happen. And in a world where there is a lot of interdependence, where it is very, very hard to figure out what the consequences of this or that action might be for other parts of the world economy. We really need to start building that up. There are lots of other forms of knowledge that I think we need to build up as well. I think we need eventually to start moving towards the multilateral level and thinking about how to radically revise the institutions we have to govern the world economy, to make them more fit for purpose in a world where we cannot just assume that everybody is committed to open markets as a broad goal, but where these can have security implications as well. And there is a lot of worry about security with respect to industrial policy as well, and some of the questions that Ms. Noor was touching on with regard to semiconductor production. That is again something where I think we need to start thinking about really how it is that a variety of national policies that we have may not add up particularly well when they're considered together, and may be to some extent self-defeating.
So if you'll, thank you. If you'll permit me a little bit of a follow-up question, just because, a few days ago was the 1-year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And if one looks back to those sort of first days, one of the first things that obviously happened, the Biden administration did, was perhaps we could argue, weaponize the international financial system. But I'm just wondering, obviously you came up with that concept long before the war broke out. I'm wondering if you see that war as sort of confirming your ideas about weaponized interdependence, or whether you actually see some ways that has changed your opinion on how things are functioning and where we're going.
So this is for me again. Yeah. So I think that it's confirmed some of our worries. I think that there is a risk of increased escalation. It's also shown, I think, that many of the risks are less the kinds of risks that people talk about, because here we're talking primarily about economic measures rather than about informational measures, and that there are many people who argued that the more that the United States and its allies tried to push this stuff, the more that we would see a fleeing towards other parts of the world, other alternative financial systems. We're not seeing that happen, at least at scale. So I think that some of the worries have not been confirmed. What we are seeing, of course, is the same kinds of things we've seen with Iran, where we see parallel shadow economies being built up in Turkey and other places, through which a lot of smuggling happens, in which a lot of problematic financial transactions can be consummated sort of outside the direct eye of the US and of Europe. And I think we're also seeing how it is that sometimes there is a risk of overreach. And one interesting example of this, I think, is that the US and Europe, I don't think, appreciated how much the cap that they have imposed on oil prices coming from Russia, how much that might disturb and upset some countries in the global south, such as Indonesia, who effectively see this as being perhaps a precursor to a buyer's cartel, in which we might see the advanced industrialized countries coming together to create a kind of buyer's OPEC, which might give them power vis-a-vis various developing countries across a wide variety of issues and a wide variety of commodities, not necessarily being limited to oil. And so I think that really what we're seeing again is here a lack of, and this is not because the officials involved are not smart, but a lack of the ability to really process what the effects of various sort of far-reaching measures are, simply because we don't have the tools to think this through. We don't have the tools to model what might happen. We don't have the data that would allow you to really figure out sort of what is what. And as I've said already, we don't have the strategic concepts that might allow you to try and create a coherent whole. And what is really, I think, a very reactive process of policymaking, as policymakers are basically forced to confront one crisis after another and hope to God that what they do prevents more harm than causing it. So we do need to move to a better and more coherent understanding.
Yeah, thank you. So now for Elina Noor, you talked about this a little bit, but now it's a chance to expand on some of the problems that you see this securitization of digital and AI exchange posing for Southeast Asian countries or developing countries in general. And if you don't want to talk more about the problems, if you want to talk about how we can actually navigate these tensions, or where you see some potential approaches that could mitigate these problems.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to try to be a little more positive and not dwell on the problems. And I think one of the areas which poses both a challenge, but also opportunity is in the policy and legal spheres. So in Southeast Asia, my sense is that the understanding of, well, we need to do more is really geared towards increasing capacity and capabilities in the technical realm of the digital spaces. So there needs to be better protection of networks and systems, critical infrastructure and cyberspace, et cetera, but there hasn't been a corresponding focus on the policies that need to be developed and the legal frameworks that need to be developed beyond data protection. So there's a lot of emphasis on protecting data, and there's this whole debate about data localization and cross-border data flows. Again, all that is very siloed in the economic and development sphere. There hasn't been as much discussion, although I will give credit to the ASEAN countries. There are some discussions now about how norms can take effect, norms of how states should behave with each other in cyberspace, where non-state actors should play in this space, and how that interaction might occur going forward. But in terms of international legal concepts and the application of international law in cyberspace itself is such a contentious issue at the United Nations. There needs to be more discussion, more conversations taking place within the region, within the ASEAN region itself. Some of that has to do with political sensitivities, the fact that it's not being discussed as much, but I think this is where the region can really contribute to some of the substantive discussions around norms and international legal frameworks. Not necessarily modeling on what's already out there, but really being creative and coming up with own national and regional perspectives that in some ways could draw lessons from Africa, from Latin America. They draw on civilizational concepts like Ubuntu in Africa and how that could govern tech. And I think Southeast Asia could really learn from other parts of the global south instead of just modeling themselves on the global north.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great point. Last question that I have before we start opening up to the Q&A. So please start typing your questions in now. So lastly for Dr. Sunami. So we've talked a little bit about this, but I'd love to hear you expand a little bit more on the specific challenges that you see for East Asia as the digital realm becomes this increasing part of the security sphere.
Yeah, I like to echo what the Professor Farrell was saying about the importance of moving this implementations things to more multilateral framework. And when we talked about economic security here in Japan, at the initial stage, there was a discussion, what do we mean by things like economic statecraft? And what is the world that surrounding it? And I remember as a graduate student at Columbia, taking a course by Professor David Baldwin, and so I went back to my home and I tried to find the book that I was reading at the time, and to understand what we mean by economic statecraft in today's digitalized world. And of course, the question of now we are announcing another phase of economic sanctions vis-a-vis Russia, whether it's feasible and so on, then supply chain issues and all these complicated things, but needs to be really discussed and implemented at the multilateral framework. And of course, G7 is one thing that we are preparing for, but then we have a CPTPP, which is very something that we still regret that the US pull out of it from TPP discussion, but now the US coming with the notion of IPEF, and whether these kind of framework really provide a much kind of rule-based way of data-driven economy, and the way we kind of share the same kind of solutions and approach to this very difficult issue. So I think as China now applying for the membership of CPTPP, and so there are a lot of political dynamics going on surrounding this kind of multilateral framework. I think it's very essential as we put these issues forward And now, of course, the Myanmar issue in ASEAN, we are also worried about the framework of ASEAN itself, whether can they hold on to, and then move on to in part of with a collaboration with things like TPP or even IPEF. So I think these kind of a multilateral approach and really trying to find a way to create more effort by leaders of the region like US, Japan, Korea, in order to really push this framework forward. I think that's very important. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll say in the session that we did about data and economics, you might say, one of our panelists, Stephanie Honey from New Zealand, pointed out that, you know, many trade agreements now, in fact, I think she said 350 of them do have some sort of data component to them, but that when we actually look at this overall and try to discern a framework, what we see is, as she put it, much energy without coherence. And so, you know, that's obviously a microcosm, I think, of a lot of the discussions that we're having as well, but for a different sphere. All right, well, let's start turning to the questions that we have. So Scott says his question is for Atsushi Sunami-san, but also interested in thoughts from the other presenters. So Scott asks, you mentioned that your foundation is looking into building a network for track 3 public intellectuals and civil society. And Scott is asking if you could expand a little bit on what that looks like in practice.
Okay. We have done this before for about 10 years, is to bring the fellowship programs to ASEAN countries, targeting to these intellectuals in the public sphere, like both journalists, scholars, and so on and so forth. What really was the idea was that even ASEAN countries, they don't know about neighbors. They know about United States, they study about United States, but say the Cambodia intellectuals not so much have an experience or understanding of their neighbor, like Vietnam and other Asia within. So we had this program to bring all these selected members, fellows from those ASEAN countries, put them all together, or even provide a chance to study other countries within the ASEAN from your own country to enhance the understanding and mutual trust among, and particularly focusing on the civil society sort of capacity building kind of intellectuals that are not in necessarily the government or think tanks, but also in the public sphere, those that are active in those areas. So we are trying to bring those programs back and see whether to put in more in the context of a younger generation or current cyber kind of context. But we are still thinking that the people needs to be more collaborative in terms of developing this kind of opportunities or providing more opportunities for within the ASEAN members to understand each other and also to work with other like Western countries. So.
Yeah, thank you. And then I'll open it up to Henry Farrell and Elina Noor, if either of you want to reflect on this sort of question of capacity building for civil society and how we do this in the digital realm.
Maybe I'll just add very briefly, you know, I think language, of course, is a great mechanism for all of us to communicate, and we do so often in English as we are doing now. But there's also the tyranny of language, and I've been reflecting on this a little more recently. And that is, for many countries in Southeast Asia, English is not necessarily the first language of many people on the ground in civil society. And I wonder if reflections on tech and concepts like privacy and, you know, even international legal concepts like use of force, we understand this on an English baseline. But were we to bring it down to the ground and try to explain these concepts to the user of tech, unfortunate term, but that's what it is, whether they might have very different notions, very different perspectives and ideas about what privacy means to them and what it should mean. And so when we adapt some of these concepts into local frameworks, into our legislation, you know, in a way we're importing ideas, and it sort of robs countries of their agency. And I wonder if we could have somehow the ability to understand how these concepts are understood from the ground up, whether those notions might be very, very different.
I don't have anything in the way of very good suggestions, but I just think that it's very interesting that both of the other panelists effectively suggest that in different ways, part of what is standing in the way of actual and sort of coordination of different ideas is, on the one hand, the United States and the omnipresence of the United States as a kind of a place that people orient themselves towards, and on the other hand, the English language as a lingua franca. So that for me is somebody, obviously, well, I'm not American originally, but I'm originally from an English language speaking country. That for me, I just think is something interesting and something that is not very much reflected on in the kinds of conversations that I'm usually involved in DC or elsewhere.
Yeah, great. So we'll move now to a question from Samantha. So Samantha is asking, what is the role of the private sector in these conversations on the securitization of tech? So do you think that the private sector is a driver of securitization and weaponization? And also, where does the private sector fit into the sort of practical solutions that we've been discussing that have focused obviously on government and civil society up to this point? So I'll throw it open for whoever wants to go first, and otherwise you'll get picked by me.
It's a very interesting set. Let me jump in, I guess. It's a very interesting set of problems. And I think about this, semiconductors, again, as Ms. Noor said, is a very, very interesting example of where we see the private sector sometimes being involved in some very uncomfortable ways, and sometimes using this new environment to its advantage. And here I think that the differences between TSMC and Intel really are sort of very, very clear examples of how this works. Very bluntly and very crudely, TSMC has found itself being obliged to build semiconductor operations in the United States, well, in Japan too, but I think that's less problematic for TSMC, but in the United States, where it clearly doesn't want to do this. It is finding it extremely hard to export its practices to the United States and to make semiconductors at the kinds of profit margins that it would like to make them, but it finds itself obliged by geopolitics to operate in ways that really work against some of its natural advantages. And then we see companies such as Intel, which have fallen behind their Asian competitors in many ways, looking to use the new regime of subsidies from the United States in order to try and boost its own interests, and at least in the earlier stage, although not so much right now, to try and hamper its competitors. So I think that very often the private sector, some private sector companies are finding themselves without a huge amount of agency in this. Others are, and they're being pressed into service. Others are looking to try to use politics in order to reshape the fundamental basis of markets in ways that are to their advantage and to their competitors' disadvantage.
Yeah, Elina, please.
Sorry. No, I think this symbiotic relationship that sometimes changes between co-optation and active recruitment by either side, at the private sector or the government sector, is an interesting one, because if we look at the origins of the internet, it started off as a private sector initiative, a government initiative, and then it morphed and sort of changed shapes. It's shapeshifter, if you will, right? And we keep seeing these tensions between both the private and public sectors. First, where you mentioned Timnit Gebru, and I keep going back to what she said about questioning the purpose of some of these tech inventions. And I think that should be our compass, and it's sort of guided even the tech sector. The protests by Google workers at the involvement of Google in Project Maven, for example. A number of these tech companies are involved in providing surveillance mechanisms and capabilities to governments in border areas. There are problematic dimensions of this for sure, but I think without the tech inventions of some of these private companies, we of course wouldn't be able to communicate in the way that we do.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Sunami, would you like to add anything to this question about the role of private sector?
Sure. I mean, the other two panelists has already mentioned that, of course, there is private sector plays very important role in this area. Things like what we are facing in Japan is a talents. And when we talk about weaponization or securitization of public sector or public sector, we need an effort, support from the private sector providing necessary talents. I mean, we're talking about even creating cyber defense unit in the self-defense force, but we just don't need enough talents to operate on that. And the one, of course, like a case of Estonia, where you have a reserved experts in the private sector ready when at the time when something necessary, emergency situation comes, they'll be called into as a reserve. And I think the line between private and public, especially in the providing talents, providing technology, there is no line actually. There is something that has to be collaborative, and there's something that is already merged in many areas. And so we need to work, even when we discuss this semiconductor strategy or even economic security policies, always the private sector that we have to ask what's going on. I mean, they are the one actually in the driver's seat actually in providing us as a very important information and the strategies and so on and so forth.
Yeah, thank you. So the next question is from anonymous attendee. So this attendee asks, Henry Farrell talked about a need for the radical revision of global governance institutions to make them fit for purpose. So what might be some first steps towards this type of revision, especially in the current global context that is not very cooperation oriented, we might say, putting it a little bit euphemistically, I'd editorialize. So Henry Farrell, over to you first.
Okay, so I think that you can look forward to very radical steps, but one straightforward step that I could see having a lot of benefit among the various allies, I'm talking particularly about Europe, the United States, Japan, South Korea, might be reaching a better understanding on industrial policy, and in a variety of ways. So clearly, a lot of the United States actions with respect to climate change technologies have upset its allies elsewhere. That's a very difficult set of problems to solve because of the need for legislation. But there are other things which might be done more easily. One of the big problems that I get from talking to people in the administration is that they are at a great disadvantage with respect to industry when they're trying to figure out where to direct their money. And it becomes very easy for big manufacturers to try to find ways of basically going to government X and saying, unless you give us X billion dollars worth of whatever, our industry is going to founder or we are going to go elsewhere. And this gives industry a lot of bargaining power vis-a-vis governments. So in effect, I do think that we want to see, as a very short step, efforts by governments to try and at the very least share information and to some extent cooperate in order to make sure that they don't end up effectively being milked by private sector interests, who of course they have an obligation to their shareholders to maximize profits, but government equally has an obligation to taxpayers not to pay over money to industry players who effectively are able to use their informational advantages and their ability to relocate in order to squeeze very, very lucrative deals from government as government moves towards subsidy. So that's not a huge suggestion. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done at the multilateral level, especially with respect to climate change and global warming. But that is, I think, a low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just open up, Dr. Sunami, if you want to add anything about if you think there's anything that needs to be revised.
I just wanted to echo what Professor Farrell was saying about learning about industry policy. And I remember when the US passed the CHIP Act, my colleague in Washington called me and says, we need to now learn seriously about industrial policy. And can Japan tell us a lesson on how success that Japan was able to conduct this? And I said, no. I mean, there are so many things that we did wrong in industrial policy. So it's something that is very interesting how we are now talking about seriously about this kind of industrial strategy and what the role of new government in fostering, and it's a new challenge, of course, by whether spending that much money for us to invite the TSMC to Japan, and on the basis of subsidies. And I mean, these are new things, and I don't know whether that was a correct industrial policy or not. It was a really, it's something that we need to really study together. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Elina Noor, anything that you want to say about global governance institutions, or if you want to talk about regional ones as well, the floor is yours.
I would just say, I mean, I understand the practicalities of, this like-minded group of countries coming together to move things forward. But in the long-term interest of global governance, especially since the majority population of the world resides outside of these like-minded countries, to be honest, they need to be also considered and brought to the table. Otherwise, there might be a separate table set up for a different sort of discussion. And if technology is really to bring people together to redress some of the social inequities in the world, then there needs to be a more inclusive form of multilateralism than there is right now. And so when we talk about global governance, it really has to be global, and multilateralism has to include more than a club of the like-minded.
Yeah, thank you. All right, we've got 3 questions left, and we've got about 5 minutes for them. So just as a warning, so I'll skip about a little bit and go to the last question first. So again, Anonymous asked, so earlier, all of you were discussing sort of potentially the need for similar steps to what was done at the start of the Cold War, potentially establishing lines of communication and red lines. So thinking of another Cold War comparison, would you argue that we are currently experiencing a cyber arms race, or is that the wrong way to think about it? So are we currently experiencing a cyber arms race or not? So Dr. Sunami, I see a contemplative face, so I'm going to ask you first for your reactions.
Well, I hope not. Actually, when we introduced these things like Society 5.0, and that was something we are hoping to solve some of the difficult social problems that we're facing, aging society, providing adequate service of healthcare throughout anywhere in the world. All these things needs to be done on the digital and technology that is enable us to do. And thinking this in a world of arms race, or in bringing back all these conflicts rather than cooperation, I think it's a very, of course, challenging thing. And that's why we need to be having this kind of webinar all the time, just to make sure that we are on the right direction together. So thank you.
Thank you. Elina Noor, Henry Farrell, anything else you want to add to that question?
I'll just say that, of course, there are more countries that are using cyberspace for offensive purposes. But I think what Dr. Sunami reminded us earlier should hold true, and that is we need to reorient how we think about tech and data-driven tech, and remind ourselves of what that purpose is, so that we think less in terms of securitization and arms race and war and conflict, and more in terms of, the benefits of tech, really.
Yeah, thank you. So next question we can go to, I've decided to take them in reverse order for no particular reason, is that obviously all 3 of you are not in Canada, but Canada has, over the last couple of days, the Canadian government has followed the European Commission and the US government in banning TikTok on government-issued devices. So this attendee would just love to hear some of the thoughts that any one of you has about this sort of recent move of banning TikTok on government-issued mobile devices in particularly Europe and North America. So maybe Henry Farrell, if you want to take that one first, and then we can have the other 2 weigh in.
Sure, I think that it's there are reasons that you might want to ban it on government devices, but the kind of legislation that is being talked about in the United States of basically of trying to ban TikTok period, or what has happened in India, I think may just be going too far. Or at least I think that I would want to see a much better set of justifications for why this constitutes the kind of big threat that some people claim that it is. Otherwise, this, I think, just becomes a almost a sign of increasing incipient paranoia. And I worry, I'm sort of, I'm not too much worried about TikTok in and of itself. I mean, I can, maybe it's just because I can live without twerking videos. I am about 30 years too old, 40 years too old to be in the appropriate demographic. But I'm not too worried about TikTok, but I am worried that if we get into a world where foreign-owned information services are treated as being suspicious just because, we begin to get into a place where all sorts of weird things could begin to happen.
Yeah, thank you. Elina Noor or Dr. Sunami, anything else that you want to add?
I'll just add a +1 to what Professor Farrell said.
I think this is really about balance, and I don't know whether banning one thing in the government sector really protects or achieves the goal that you really wanted to do, leaving out the private or other spaces that are more effective. But also I think the issue of this open shared information and the value of open shared information for advancing things like technology or science or something that we need to be advancing in order to solve our common problems. And so I think it's really, this is something that I'm looking forward to. This is a difficult issue, but I know that the G7 science ministerial meeting happening this year would be focusing somewhat one issue on open science and about the value of open science and collaboration. We trying to ban things or, security and other things are important, but also we need to be talking about how we can collaborate in the cyberspace at the same time. Otherwise, we're just sort of scared of everything that comes out of and start thinking whether it's safe to use or, all sorts of things. So.
Yeah, thank you. I would add just one thought from my perspective, which is that for me, perhaps the more important news, if we're thinking about TikTok in a global realm, was that TikTok is now going to have more sort of ability for researchers to access it. But as far as we know, this is only currently released in one country, and that is the United States. So what we see is TikTok in many ways sort of following exactly the same playbooks as a Facebook or a Twitter. And if we're looking at these companies from a global perspective, that raises a lot of, I think, questions and concerns about where these companies really care about and what that means for people in the majority of the world and our transparency and open science that you just talked about. All right, we have one last question and we have 1 minute for it. So Professor Farrell, it's for you. You'll have to be quick. So you mentioned that misinformation will become more prevalent as AI becomes more popular, like ChatGPT. And this person wants to know examples of this, how it can spread, and also whether you have any thoughts about how to monitor these kinds of technologies.
Okay, really hard questions. I guess there are some examples. Bruce Schneier has a great new book on hacking, which provides some detailed discussion of how these can be used to hack democratic information systems. I recommend that, and not just because he is a co-author. Trying to push back against this, it's really, really hard to detect. I'm sort of at the moment, offense has the advantage. It is possible maybe with 20 or 30% accuracy to use machine learning to generate this kind of large language model generated stuff, which is far, far less than you would need for it to be useful. So I think that the two ways in which we could see this this being partially mitigated, one is to have rules on watermarking. That is that you have digital watermarks on these forms of outputs to make it more difficult to just slip them in. Obviously, that sort of poses the problem of what happens when you have sort of software which is sort of outside of the jurisdiction. The second thing I think we're going to need to have much more move towards secure digital identities, what Glenn Weil and Vitalik Buterin have called soul-bound tokens, and similar kinds of proofs of authenticity, which you can use to say, yes, you are a real person. Here is somebody who you trust, who vouches for you. And we're going to start to need to think about how to build up that infrastructure in order to try and create some mitigating strategies.
Thank you. Well, please all join me, at least virtually, in thanking our three panelists, Henry Farrell, Atsushi Sunami, and Elina Noor. We could have ended this conversation where we began, which was perhaps with a sort of negative scenarios, but instead I think I at least have left this 75 minutes with a whole host of different ideas on actually how we can be moving forward, and with a renewed sense of optimism, at least in, as Dr. Sunami said, the dialogue that we can have together across countries and across time zones. As you see here in Vancouver, the sun is setting and it's time at least for us to go and have some dinner. So please join me in thanking our three wonderful panelists. We really appreciate you joining us. Thank you all so much.